in the den of iniquity. Vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment. What a pity. Tomorrow never certain. What dwells behind the curtain? The face of evil lurking with that shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble that either pop or topple. Many will fall and stumble. Let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso. Cannons could reach the towers and the troops will storm the castle. Hey, I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. With the rubble steady rising, and hearts are compromising. Convictions here are stifling, making evil appetizing. The fists are steady forming, and countenance is falling. Defenses are withdrawing, possibilities are falling. In these your circumstances, evil will make advances. Pick up your sword and lances, and be sure to take your stances. Victory is never promised, the battle is upon us. Gather the brave and honest, and the righteous in your corners.
Hey there, hey there, hey there. Yes, yes, yes. Welcome, 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 ladies and gentlemen. And today we're going to have a free flowing conversation about a topic that is rather important. My name is Ike Ogiamian. Welcome to my channel. Over here, we talk about being better and doing better with a strong emphasis on doing. And what are we doing today? We are going to familiarize ourselves with a set of statistics which one tends to keep track of. And by one, I mean society at large, the media. It is a source of, shall we say, political fodder. The politicians are out there talking about crime. Is it rising? Is it not? How much is it rising? How much of it are we having? Today, we're going to focus specifically on violent crime, specifically homicide. Yes, we know what homicide is, ladies and gentlemen. It is what you thought it was. Okay, so we're going to be talking about that. And as you guys can tell, I am still in Ghana. I'm still in Accra because this is not my usual setup. And it's not the usual time either. So how's everybody doing today? How's spiritual logic in the building? Shout out to you. Shout out to you indeed. We got Aaron B in the house holding it down. A says practitioner. How are you? So today, the title is called The Truth. Okay? The truth behind the crime statistics that we're seeing, the rise in crime. Now, the truth is going to take many different forms. So shall we say there are many different aspects to truth. And we're going to start out with the facts, the data, the statistics, and we're going to look at the very direct interpretation of what we mean. Okay? And then there's a narrative aspect. There's the narrative. There's what people are saying. Defund the police, don't defund the police. Law and order, less law and order. This is the part where things get a little bit murky because we're talking about the narrative. Okay? And then with that, there's a socio-economic thread through the narrative, which inevitably gets us to racial politics. And we're going to talk about that as well. The particular groups, the particular locations, the particular locales in which the crime is occurring, the peoples that are being affected by such, and what are their thoughts and what are the narratives that are out there. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, yes, yes. That is what we are talking about today. Shout out to Spiritual Logic. Dropping a comment here regarding his thoughts, says the global reset is disturbing the underground crime arena. And those who lived on the fence are barely surviving and they're getting desperate. So desperation perhaps is a way, a particular narrative to describe, to encompass, to try to wrap our heads around a hypothesis for the data that we're seeing. We're going to talk about the data, and then we're going to get into the narratives, and we're going to talk about whether or not it is possible to actually predict rise in crime. Shout out to Beauty Thug in the house. Shout out to Soul Provider. Yes, yes, yes. If you guys are not already subscribed, go ahead and subscribe to Soul Provider's channel. So let's get right into it. Crime is on the rise, but that's in terms of the spike. There is a spike, there's a sharp rate of increase. But let's look, okay, let's take a close look, if you will, at a particular graph. Okay, let's look at a particular graph and let's see what we can say about it. Because shout out to people such as Steven Pinker, I believe. Is his name Steven? Can the chat help me out? Is Mr. Pinker's name, is his first name Steven? He writes, okay, books such as The Better Angels of Our Nature, highlighting the fact that violence in general and violent crime has been reducing all through human history, especially in recent time. We've seen a sharp decrease and we've seen a great rise, especially in the third world when it comes to economic prosperity. He talks about the fact that things are indeed getting better and better. And the graph that we see here when it comes to homicide shows us that yes, when it comes to the total number of people getting bodied out there, things are down. Things are down. But what has happened recently, because this graph here, this chart here, and perhaps let me make it a little bigger. Okay. This chart here goes up to a certain point. But overall, we see the trend. It starts from a certain year, goes up to a certain year. It's not up to recent times, but we see the trend of things going down. Thanks, Taboo Smash. It is Steven Pinker. So, what are we talking about then when we say crime is rising? Well, we're talking about the fact that, well, the slope is starting to go upwards. For those of you who took statistics, we're talking about the derivative. The first derivative, we're talking about the acceleration, because we don't just care about the positions of things, we also care about the speed of those things. We don't just care about the speed, sometimes we care about the acceleration, the rate of change, right? The rate of change. So recently, rather than the slope going down, we've seen a sharp uptick in the slope going up. And what kind of numbers are we talking about specifically? What kind of numbers are we talking about? Well, basically, year over year increase in crime. The last time or the last high, what would you say a high percentage of crime increase would be? What would that number be to you? Is 10% high? Can we get a guess in the chat? 10% increase, is that high? Is it 5% increase? When was the last high? The last high actually was between 19, I believe 67 and 68. Somewhere in the late 60s is when we had the sharpest uptick again year over year. The change from one year to the next. The rate of speed up of the crime, right? This is what we're talking about here. We're talking about the slope of the curve. What will be a high number? And why are we concerned about the number that we're recently getting? What will be a number that you would be comfortable with? And what are we seeing now? It turns out that, as I'm saying here, let me go ahead and see if I can make a check on this. Okay. Between 1967 and 1968 was the last record, and that was 12% increase. Between 1967 and 1968, there was a 12% increase in homicide. And now, between 2019 and 2020, we have broken that record, ladies and gentlemen. We have broken that record. And we have a 30% increase. 30%, more than double the last high. Remember, we're not saying that there are more murders, okay? No. It's been going up. So provider says 3 to 7% will be high for him. Interesting. Well, 30% increase in homicide is what we saw between 2019 and 2020. The last high, the previous high, okay, in terms of that rate of change, was in between 1967 and 68, and that was 12%. So we've more than doubled it, and now we have a new record. Again, overall numbers are lower, but we have a little spike going up right now, a very quick change, right? Something quickly happening is something that we also pay attention to. Again, we're talking about the truth, and so far, we're just looking at the numbers and exactly the numbers, or shall we say, the interpretation of the numbers. Not so far removed into the narrative yet. But when people are talking about the rate of crime or crime going up, this is what they mean. They don't mean that, oh my God, more people are getting killed than ever before. No, overall, just like the graph that I showed you, and just like people like Stephen Pinker will tell you, it is true that crime, violent crime, is going down. Stephen Pinker tends to take a more global view, and he talks about violence decreasing all through the world, and also economic prosperity going up, especially in the third world, if you will. However, there is a sharp increase of the sort we haven't seen since the late 60s. And what is the, yes, homicides, homicides, 30% increase between 2019 and 2020. So y'all have been busy out there. Y'all have been busy out there. So if we then take a step into the whole world of, well, then why? Spiritual logic talked about the fact that the Great Reset, meaning economic factors, and clarify if you will, or correct me, if economic is a good umbrella to, shall we say, transmit the information that you were trying to get across. When you say the Great Reset is affecting the underworld, and also people who were on the fence are getting desperate, more likely now to pull the trigger, perhaps. Some people might say, hey, we have the 91 DVOC, the 91 DVOC, bear flu or whatever, and people are being shut into their houses. So now that caused some economic turmoil. And also, there is a question of the trust in the police. Bear with me, if you will. There's an airplane going overhead. Shout out to Spiritual Logic for confirming that economic is a good way of conveying the information that we're saying. So, if we talk about other things that happen, other corollary pieces of data, okay, this is what you do when you want to think through analysis. You have one piece of something happening here, and you ask, well, what are the other pieces of stuff happening in here? And how can I track, okay, how these things are related? Okay? If I look over time, if I hold one piece of data, which will be homicides, if I hold that fixed and then I vary all these other things, I look through the years in terms of economic uncertainty, or shall we say, the economic difference, the difference in the economic status between people, the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, things of that nature. How does that affect it? How does the trust in the police affect it? Shout out to George Floyd and the protests, defund the police type movements and the narratives that are out there. The actual fact that certain jurisdictions are taking money from one place and put it in another place. As a matter of fact, you will find, even though we're going to discuss all the many different factors next, which is what we're segueing into now, you'll find that it is quite impossible in real time to say exactly what is causing crime to increase or decrease. Now, why is it impossible? Spiritual logic just gave us some definitive, shall we say, a definitive position on one of the factors. The reason it's impossible is not because you cannot enumerate factors, it's because you don't know what weight to give the different factors at any particular time. And there's just so many factors. Can I get a one in the chat if this particular narrative, which I just gave as to why it is impossible in real time, I'm not talking about looking in hindsight, okay? You can look back in hindsight, okay? And you can take all kinds of data from all kinds of places in the world, do this corollary statistical comparisons, and you can come up with a very neat story. But in real time, it is impossible to do so, not because you cannot give the parameters, right, or the variables, but because the variables are numerous, they affect each other, and you don't know which weight to put on one variable versus the other. Let's give a broad swath of the different kinds of variables, just the categories of variables. Spiritual logic has given us the economic front. Okay? The economic variable, always the first one that we look at, because one thing that we do know, for example, is that the difference in economic status amongst young men, right? If you have really, really poor young men and really, really rich young men in a particular box, the crime goes up. Is any of us surprised about that? We're not surprised that this particular parameter, which is the difference between the amount of economic status difference, the sharper it gets amongst men, the crime tends to go up. So looking at the economy in general and the fact that we know that crime, okay, so the bottom rung of crime tends to be for economic ends. It's not that, everyone is just out there being a serial killer or something. And that those things can then escalate into homicide, for example, right? So it's a good place to start. But you also have things such as the trust in the police, police funding, law enforcement, and where law enforcement chooses to emphasize its actions. That's another factor. We have factors all the way down to things such as people's diet and exercise and whether or not they're stressed in 2019 and 2020. How stressed are they in 2020 versus other times? So we see that all the way from the individual psychology, diet, and exercise, all the way to macro factors such as the economy, we can point out plausible parameters and factors that will affect the crime rate. But in real time, no one can say exactly why. Okay. And with any reasonable measure of accuracy. But this does not stop us, and this should not stop us from discussing the possible reasons. And why would that be? Why should we be discussing the possible reasons? Well, because the narratives and the narratives affect the political action that we take, and these political actions have material effects, and material effects meaning effects that actually matter in the real world. Ladies and gentlemen, divide and conquer, says spiritual logic. Divide and conquer. So as we continue the conversation, I'm going to go ahead and drop the link just in case. And before I forget, I've been experimenting lately. Last time I did a little stream of consciousness stream, and this time I'm actually dropping the link. I rarely do that. But so far we've established a couple of things, which is that overall, in terms of aggregate numbers, homicides are down. But recently, we have seen a spike of 30% year over year between 2019 and 2020. The last record was in the late 60s, between 1967 and 68. Then it was 12%, a 12% increase. Now we have 30%. Okay, that's almost a third of 100% increase year over year. And that causes us to scratch our heads, even though the numbers are low. But why this sharp spike? And people are speculating about different things. Let's move on to the narratives that are out there and the things that people are saying about how the ways in which we are allowed to talk about crime may be affecting crime itself. Ladies and gentlemen, what do I mean by that? What I mean is, as time progresses in any particular epoch, any particular historical frame, there are things which are okay to say and things which are not so okay to say in polite company, if you will. Call it the politically correct meter or call it the Overton window, right? In other words, at some point in time or at any point in time, there's certain things that are okay to say right there in the middle, nice and politically correct. And then you start to stray out into the edge and things start to look a little, people start to kind of turn their noses at you. So basically, what are we saying? It is not particularly popular amongst the major organs of the media, such as New York Times, Washington Post, to talk about an increase in police efforts or an increase in law enforcement. Does that make sense? Can I get a one in the chat? It's not popular right now to talk about, well, we need to crack down on crime. No, the zeitgeist kind of conversation is more on the, shall we say, do we have to defund the police, right? Do we need more community policing or change the ways in which policing happen? It's more on the softer end of things. This has material consequences in the way we think about things, the political actions that we take. Again, we don't know in real time what causes these things to happen. We can enumerate various parameters, but we cannot give real time weights to these different parameters. Okay? That's just how things are. And if we think about it, we know that that makes sense. But is it not interesting that in this time, when crime is taking this sharp uptick, homicides, we're talking about 30% year over year. Here goes another plane. 30% year over year, we're also in a situation whereby it is not so popular to talk about cracking down on crime, whereby the trust in the police, if you will, is really, really low, whereby monies in certain police departments is being moved away from certain focuses, areas of focus, and put into other areas of focus, where are having to make particular decisions as to, well, where they focus their resources. Places like Minneapolis is experiencing this. You know, we can always talk about Chicago. We can always talk about Chicago, can we not? Shout out, shout out, shout out to Dr. Thunder in the house. Thank you for dropping the super chat. $5 super chat saying just paying my way. Okay. So, what are the narratives that are out there? What are the narratives that are out there? So, one thing that people would take on is, well, you know what? Crime is going up, not just because of the economic factors that spiritual logic mentioned, but because of the reduction in the trust in police. And hey, the cops are not wanting to intervene as much. Okay. Is that a plausible one to you, ladies and gentlemen? Is that a plausible? How much weight do you put to the fact that the cops are less likely to intervene in certain ways? Shout out to Spiritual Logic. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. You guys, if you're not already subscribed to Spiritual Logic, make sure you go ahead and do so. Subscribe to his channel. He's got good content out there. So that's another narrative that is out there. The narrative of, hey, we are saying defund the police. The trust in the police is going down. Hence, people are less likely to cooperate with the police. So goes the narrative, right? And if people are less likely to cooperate with the police, trust is down with the cops are less likely to intervene in certain ways. It'll make other people more bold. These kinds of, and other people, I mean criminals, right? These kinds of narratives, hypotheses are out there to explain the data that we see. What is the data? We're focusing on one particular data point, which is a 30% spike in homicides between 2019 and 2020. The previous record was 12% in the late 60s. Shout out to you for another, or shall we say, a $5 super chat. Shout out to Sick Lid in the building. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, people emboldened to do certain things. Well, some may say, well, how? How is that the case? Well, they have certain data points, these particular people whom will, shall we say, carry on this narrative about, well, it is about the fact that the cops are less likely to react or the trust is down, thereby emboldening people. Well, they'll point out to, shall we say, the stores getting looted openly in San Francisco or Los Angeles because indeed of because indeed, right, the cops are less likely to react in these places. So they would say, well, this supports their theory. They would say that this supports their theory. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please go ahead and like, subscribe, share the video, sharing in your WhatsApp, your Facebook, your Instagram, your group text, or if you have a YouTube channel, your community tab is very helpful. Yes, 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 it's very helpful. And this is indeed a very important conversation, a conversation which bears discussing, not just because of the particulars, not just because of the particulars, but because it's a segue to talk about things such as narrative, a segue to talk about how we analyze data, a segue to talk about what we can actually know versus what we do not know, and how people think they know things, but they really don't know things. Right? People think they know things, but they do not know things, and all those other kinds of things, ladies and gentlemen. So, it is not possible to actually know why crime goes up. We must not forget that when we look at or when we try to give weight to the various narratives that are out there, the various parameters that are out there. Okay? Let me throw out another kind of narrative that may say, hey, maybe crime just has a metabolism of its own. Because we must not forget that this is a particularly American phenomenon. What I mean is the homicide thing. Not particularly American, but America has its America has its own particular stake there, its own particular draw, its own particular claim as to the attentions paid to homicide, violent crimes, especially with guns, right? So shall we say, one narrative could just be, well, this is America, right? And shout out to Karine Austin. Very generous $5 super chat. An iPhone user. Fatherlessness. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Again, the way these studies are done, okay, the ways in which to analyze data is not to just jump to conclusions, but to be honest about what we can and cannot know. So when we take one particular parameter, which in this case we're talking about the uptick in crime, not the total number over the years is lower now than it was in the 60s, or shall we say at some point in the 90s. Okay, we showed a graph earlier, and perhaps we might share it again. Okay, perhaps we might share it again. as to how things have been going down over time. But right now, we have a sharp uptick, a sharp acceleration. And this acceleration is a new record. So that we know. And now there's a whole slew of parameters that we could look at. One of the big ones that people first look at, and economists do these studies, is economic factors, because we know for sure over time and different populations that if you have great economic disparity, okay, and in a population where there's a lot of young men, so you got a lot of poor young men and a lot of rich young men, or shall we say the difference is rather large, then you're going to have an very high rate of crime. This that what I just mentioned tends to be true in cities, right? Cities are places where you're going to have great difference in economic status, and you're also going to have a lot of young men, whom are the ones who tend to do the murking out there. So these kinds of things we know. So you put out economic variables. You put out variables such as the defunding of the police. Are the police less trusted, or the police less likely to react? Is this emboldening certain people? We'd put out narratives such as the what the Overton window says it's okay to talk about. It is more okay to talk about defunding the police right now than to talk about cracking down on crime. Spiritual logic talks about things such as fatherlessness. Okay, is that in an increase? Is a single parent childhood increasing? Okay, will that not affect on and on and on? But we cannot put in real time weight to these particular parameters, and we must know that when we go around talking about the possibilities and the different parameters. But we can talk about things that we can invalidate somewhat. We can invalidate certain parameters, right? Such as, well, it's not because the color of the cop cars in Minneapolis changed. That's not why crime is going up. So we can invalidate certain parameters or certain factors, but because of the myriad of factors that we have, and in our ability and our inability in real time to put weights to these, we do not know in real time why things are occurring the way they do occur. Okay, so I was talking about some other narrative. I was talking about this is America. This is America. Got my mic tripping. I got the gap. I got the carry 'em. This is America, and perhaps crime just has a metabolism of its own. Just like you have a metabolism, or you have a regularity, let's say, and at some point you're going to do certain things with regards to, let's say, certain metabolic functions, and that America is just going through its particular thing right now, and there's no reason for us to be looking and thinking too much about it. There is no reason for us to be thinking too much about it. That'll be another narrative, and it is supported by certain facts. Okay? Supported by certain facts. The criminal enterprise, indeed. So, things start getting a little bit more interesting, though, right? Because one of the big elephants in the room is, where are these crimes increasing? And what do the particular communities have to say about this increase in crime? Which communities are most affected, and what do the communities have to say about it? So, we're still in the narrative area of this conversation. This stream is titled The Truth, The Truth, The Truth, and nothing but the truth about the increase in crime statistics. We talked about what the statistics are in particular, And now we're going into the various narratives, including what is okay to talk about versus what is not okay to talk about, and how that affects political action, which then has a material effect on crime, even though we cannot tell in real time which way it's going to go. But if you reduce funds of the cops or you move it from one place to the other, it will have some kind of effect. Or you could say it could have some kind of effect. In other words, it's a plausible parameter. It's not a parameter such as changing the color of the cop cars. You could say, let's remove that parameter, that variable. That's one that's not going to affect things, right? So let me say something, and then we'll get into this whole community aspect. Thanks. Yes, yes. This is my Africa base. I'm going to be here in Ghana for a while. Been here already about 6 weeks now, and things are going well. Business is going well. And I'll be here till February. And then I'll be back in the San Francisco base. So let me give a little bit of a narrative. You see, a lot of people talk about the oppression, the systemic oppression, okay, that leads to, let's say, something like the increased incarceration rates of particular populations. The war on drugs, for example, which, by the way, was not the cause of that. It was not a significant cause of the great spike in the incarceration. Not as significant as people might think. Okay. But people would accurately note that a lot of the call for increased law enforcement came from the populations themselves. In other words, in this case, if you're talking about African Americans being incarcerated in high numbers, spiking up, okay, a lot of the call for the increased law enforcement came from the African American population itself. Can I get a one in the chat if that is well understood? If this is not something that is in dispute, and that actually statistical data today that show that the African American population does not really go down for the let's remove the police from the street. This is not to say that they're not for better policing, better training, and all those other kinds of things. But one could look anecdotally, and one could also look at data in terms of polls of African American populations, especially populations that are affected by the crime. These people are not saying, get the cops out. Okay? And this is something that we know about, like, let's say the people talk about the crime bill in the 90s, for example. This was heavily pushed by the communities that were affected by the crime. So human beings, and shall we say, especially aggregate, large socioeconomic trends are more complicated than we like to think. Okay? They're more complicated than we like to think. And remember, I just pointed out a fact. I haven't even given a narrative on it yet. I'm just saying that, look, if you poll certain populations, they're not saying get rid of the cops. If you poll certain populations, they're saying, hey, you need to crack down on the crime. However, where we can where both, let's say, the left and the right or whatever tends to be able to agree on is better training, better outcomes in terms of encountering of the police. Or shall we say, taking away the cops, the encounter with the police from the life of Omar. Omar is somebody that shout out to O'Shea Duke Jackson in the building. Shout out to O'Shea Duke Jackson in the building, announcing his profound brokenness to us with his meager 50, probably Polish currency. Okay. Now, the polls that are done that tell you that if you go to the black communities and the leaders of these communities, that's the pastors and the mothers of those people getting gunned down and all that kind of stuff. They're not saying get rid of the cops. Okay. The people whom have to deal with high crime typically are not saying, don't protect me. They're saying other things about what the problem with policing is. And can I get a one kweku if that is clear as to answering your question? And generally speaking, if this makes sense, you can go look at the polls. But also, does it just make sense from an anecdotal narrative point of view that, hey, if you go to a community where the people are suffering the effects of high crime, people are not going to say, yeah, get rid of the cops. They may say things, and they do say things as we need better policing, people need to be better trained, and perhaps we need to reduce the encounter of between the police and everyday people. Take an everyday person in that community, let's call him Omar, right? Here's something. If Omar is in community A, and let's say community A is inner city, urban, poor, okay? The kind of place where there's high crime, perhaps drug use, prostitution, things like that. That's community A. Omar is in there. And Omar is just a regular average Joe. So he's going to make regular average Joe type mistakes. In other words, you, me, everybody, we all break the law. Can I get an amen? This is something that needs to be, it needs to be very clear. You, me, everybody, we're breaking the law. Okay? If you look at how complex and convoluted the thousands and thousands of sections of the federal code, just the federal code is, and all the complex myriad ways in which you can become entangled with the federal code such that it constitutes a violation, you're breaking the law, bro. You ever driven over 55 in an interstate? Hey, Doug, spiritual logic, you ever driven over 55 in an interstate? Let's just take that for example. And another one we know, I don't think anybody can ever say, even if you have a clear conscience about it, you cannot say definitively that you have not broken some IRS code. I mean, Omar is in community A, and he's a regular person, meaning he's breaking the law. Okay? Omar is in community A, regular person breaking the law, just like you and me. Community A is intercity, urban, poor, drugs. You get the picture. Put Omar in community B, okay? Let's say somewhere like Orange County in Southern California, okay? Relatively affluent, lots of space, not particularly urban and dense, okay? And he's just average Joe breaking the same rules that you and I break, such as going over 55 in the interstate. In which community is Omar going to encounter the police more? Community A or community B? Community A, intercity, urban, economically impoverished, high crime. Same Omar breaking the same rules that you and I break. Riding dirty from time to time. Maybe his tags are expired. Maybe he's doing over 55 on the interstate. Community A or community B? Can we get a vote in the chat? So, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because the people in community A are not saying, hey, take the cops out. They're saying there must be better policing such that A, for example, the rate of encounters that Omar has with the police in community A needs to drop down or at least get closer to what it would be in community B. Because the more you encounter the police, the more stuff is likely to go wrong. The more you encounter the police, the more you're going to believe in certain kinds of narratives about how the police is trying to keep you down. And the more that becomes the case, the less trust you have in the cops, the less you're likely to cooperate with the cops. And then the vicious circle or cycle continues. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is true that in the African American community, there is a call for more crackdown in crime. Makes sense because, people's kids are getting shot, right? But there is a narrative out there of systemic racism. In other words, let me ask this question. Because something else, so number one is you have the population asking for more policing, the same population that is systemically being oppressed by a narrative called systemic oppression, right? And another fact, number two, is you have a lot of Black police officers, Black city councilmen, right? Black police councils making decisions that lead to more incarcerations. Is this an argument against systemic racism? What do you think? Is it an argument against systemic racism to say, well, how can it be systemic racism when indeed the African Americans are asking for the law enforcement? How can it be systemic racism when indeed you have Black police chiefs and so on and so forth? Again, we're using this topic in order to think. Thinking truly is what this channel is all about. And how to consume these kinds of informations without getting run into some kind of a little corner that these different actors, politicians mainly, and the media want us to get into is what this is about. Right? Let's see what's going on in the chat. There is a question on the table, ladies and gentlemen. The question on the table is, there's something called systemic racism. It is a narrative. It says that the system oppresses certain groups of people with regards to certain outcomes. In this case, let's talk about rates of incarceration. And then a counter, and I'm asking, is this a good counter? To say, hey, but that same community is asking for law enforcement, and that same community has representatives, Black mayors, Black police chiefs, Black police council people, enacting things that lead to more incarceration. How do we reconcile these two things? Okay. It is not as complicated as it seems. It is a simple logic puzzle, ladies and gentlemen. Let's see what's going on here. Everyday person in the community lives in contradiction to the police, 100%. And that's why, laws are there to be broken. We don't make laws so that, everybody just goes scot-free. No. It is, and I'm not saying that it is some kind of conspiracy. It's just a fact of human society that the kinds of laws that we make are such that you and I are going to be breaking one or two every day, 1 or 2 or 10 every day. So if Omar is in one particular community, he's more likely to get caught or get into some kind of beef with the law because of his expired tags than if he was in another community, driving a different kind of car, driving through a different kind of neighborhood. Okay? So, where both left, right, center, and everybody can come together on, reasonable people that is that there needs to be better outcomes with regards to the amount of times that Omar encounters the cops and the kinds of reactions that the cops have with respect to Omar. Okay? But that generally this population is not asking for less police presence, that it tends to be a different person that says defund the police. It's a different person with a different profile. They are more college educated and elite, these people that tend to say, get rid of the cops, that kind of thing, right? It's a small percentage, by the way. So the narrative of, oh, everybody's saying defund the police, or oh, the left is saying defund the police. No, it's not the left. It's very few people that say that kind of stuff. Okay? Very few people that say that kind of stuff. So here's the answer to the question. It is not true that just because you have guards that are from the oppressed population, that the system that keeps them oppressed and chained is not against that population. You see, in the Jewish ghettos in Warsaw, Poland, where the Nazis kept them, okay, the overseers, the overseers were Jewish, right? So this is a typical thing that happens. I'm not saying that systemic racism is a true narrative. I'm saying that you cannot counter it by saying that the guards and the watch people and the people that are in the system asking for the kinds of things that lead to certain kinds of outcomes, that they're part of the population that's being oppressed, is not logically sound. It does not follow that just because the people look a certain way, because you have black guards, black police, black this, black that black people are not being oppressed by the system. Okay? Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. So we're getting into a little bit of the psychology of the black officers versus the white officers. A little bit of the psychology. Sup, Leroy? Welcome to the conversation. So, if somebody says, hey, and I agree with you there in the sense that when you're from a particular population, you actually have this impetus to voice certain things or be certain ways just to kind of show that you are indeed a righteous thinking person. Okay? So, again, just because you have black cops, black police chiefs, black police council members, black mayors enacting certain rules that lead to increase in black incarceration doesn't mean that systemic racism is not correct. I have other arguments against systemic racism, but that one does not logically follow. But since we're sticking with the whole crime story, we're not going to get bogged down and fly into the whole systemic racism arena. But we're talking about narratives that bear upon the increase, the sharp spike in homicides that we've seen recently. 30% increase in homicide between 2019 and 2020. That's the new record that we have. The previous high was in between 1967 and 1968, and that was 12%. Overall, the total number of homicides is down, okay? Steven Pinker is correct. Okay, things are better. We look at the chat. We look at the chart here, the graph. Things are down, but we've seen a sharp spike, a sharp increase in the slope going upward recently. We've talked about what that is, which is an acceleration. And then we talked about the narratives. Pardon me, another plane flying over. We've talked about the narratives. We've talked about what is okay to say with regards to parameters and what is not okay to say. We've talked about the fact that nobody can know for sure in real time why crime goes up. And we talked about why that is. You cannot know. If you think you know, you're deceiving yourself. But you can talk about the valid parameters. You can talk about the fact that the economy tends to have something to do with it. You could talk about the fact that, let's say, joblessness, listlessness, the police definitely has something to do with it. Whether or not they're responding in certain ways, trust in the police has something to do with it. You can also talk about the diet and exercise of the population and how stressed they are. All these are factors, right? But then we also have narratives, okay? And what you're allowed to talk about, which have political implications, and these political implications in turn have material effects and consequences on the crime itself. So, as we continue to have the conversation, we went inevitably into the racial dimension because when one starts talking about these socio-economic factors, one has to get there. One has to get there, doesn't one? So we said things such as, well, this is America. Maybe crime just has a metabolism of its own and it does its thing. Just like you have your thing and you're going to have regular bowel movements and it has a logic of its own and it's just time for a bowel movement. Hence, there's no particular reason why we need to start looking at it, right? We talk about the fact that some people say, hey, it's because people are saying defund the police. It's because people are saying, hey, less trust in the cops. Therefore, it's emboldening certain people and the cops are less likely to act. So that's another narrative. It's because we cannot say crack down on crime, but rather we can say defund the police. That's another kind of narrative. Okay. We've now left the realm of logical analysis, which we've already said that it's impossible in real time to predict vis-a-vis this crime thing. And while in the arena of narratives and the particular political action that they tend to lead to, because that has material effect, that's where we're at. And then we went into the racial thing, and we're still there. We are still there, ladies and gentlemen. Theo Waff, how's it going? Says, hey there, Ike. Hey there, Theo. Asking if I will do an argument on the systemic, and it will be an argument against any systemic X. And so I have an argument against systemic X of many kinds and why they're problematic as a narrative. They're problematic as a means of interpreting the data that we see. They're problematic in terms of how to prescribe the action that needs to be taken. And they're problematic by definition in the sense that they're hard to define. And you can read many, many books about it, but it gets very, shall we say, macro. And the guiding principle, here's one of my guiding principles when it comes to macro. It is easy to macro BS than it is to micro BS. And Leroy, we're talking about homicides. 30% increase, United States. This is FBI statistics and CDC statistics. 30% increase between 2019 and 2020. The last highest increase was between 1967 and 68. That was 12%. So it is a lot easier to macro BS than to micro BS, right? Just think about it. When it comes to little things, small things, things for which you can immediately see the effects, local things, it's hard to BS. But when you look at big picture, it is very easy to throw all kinds of narratives around. Now, the BS aspect is one aspect. The other aspect is that what is to be done, okay? The macro picture, especially when you talk about things that the systemic picture, it's not a good way of prescribing what needs to be done, okay? Also, but that is the shape that my argument against systemic X, that's the shape that it takes. Okay. But again, we are here to talk about the fact, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that crime is going up. In particular, we're talking about homicides. Okay. Overall, it is down. When you look at the charts, it's down. But right now, we have a sharp spike, 30% year over year, which is crazy. A third of 100%. Okay. A third of 100%. Let me see here. Excuse me. Pardon my virus. Okay. So let's get to the place where it's particularly interesting. Homicide, domestic violence, related self defense. Okay. It's interesting about how one can break down the data in terms of, well, is the domestic violence thing spiking up relative to other kinds of crime, other kinds of homicides, right? Because one of the things we said is that the stress due to the lockdown, okay, because the first thing that we started was the big picture of economics, right, in terms of parameters, plausible parameters, even though we know that it is difficult in real time to give the appropriate weight to each one of these parameters that affect the big picture. But if you look at the breakdown of, well, is domestic violence leading to more of the homicides, or is it more of X, Y, or Z? What is the mix, right? What is the mix in this increase? Will give us some better way of analyzing the data. Okay? Let's get to the juicier point. What is the juicier point? What is the juicier point? The juiciest point is whom is committing the crime. And this is not for sensationalism, ladies and gentlemen. If let's look at whom is committing the crime, not for sensationalism, but as a way of highlighting appropriate ways of analyzing data and coming to conclusions. And one of the best conclusions one can come to is I don't know. You know what I mean, Leroy? Too many people knowing things out there that they do not actually know, but they're just out there claiming to know crap. Right? And I like the question that you asked there, Leroy, in terms of like, okay, oh, here's this number. Okay, how can we break it down? Too many people jump to conclusions about things that are knowable. It is not knowable in real time what exactly increases crime. It is not knowable. But a lot of people claim to know. All they're doing is just mentioning one factor in the equation, and they don't know what weights to give that factor or the particular timeline, or basically, you don't know. But one of the main things when it comes to analyzing data is to understand how little we can know and predict. And to understand how the population is therefore manipulated by things that nobody knows. In other words, Rather than listen to this whole talk about what is the data, increase versus total aggregate, right? And what are the various parameters? Plausible parameters, less plausible parameters. What can we know? What can we not know? What are the narratives? People don't want to listen to that crap, okay? People want to be told something, and then they want to run into some group of other idiots that have been told something, and then they want to do mob stuff. Isn't that right? Is that not right? Can I get a one in the chat? In the sense that understanding how little you can actually know and predict in real time will give you a clear view into how the populace is constantly manipulated into knowing things, running into groups of other people whom know things and act like a mob. This is human nature. You're not going to change it. And by human nature, I mean majority of people, the mass, right? The mass are not going to listen to this conversation and actually sit down and say, well, I don't really know, but I can discuss about the plausible parameters. I don't really know, but I can discuss about, well, you have black police chiefs and black cops, black mayors making decisions that lead to higher incarceration of black people. How does that mesh with systemic racism? Now, people don't want to think of those kinds of things. People don't want to be like, I don't know. People love to quote unquote know crap that they don't know so that they can act and feel comfortable in a cohort of people taking action together. This is never going to change, but understanding of it is important to the degree to which you want power in this world. And power just means agency, right? You may not want to rule the mob, but if you want to rule the mob, it's important to know these things too. Very important not to be one of the mob if you want to rule them, by the way. Okay? It is very important. Even if you're going to be a total demagogue, if you're going to be that person that is, waving, whipping them into a frenzy, you don't necessarily want to be one of them because then you're out of control. You have no control. You have no agency. You're not really running the mob is running you. But anyways, to the degree to which you want to have understanding, knowledge, which is power, one of the main things, such as Socrates told us over 2,500 years ago, is that he knows that he does not know. And it takes a lot to get to that point. So, moving into the juicier aspects of things, we say, hey, there's a particular cohort of people, black people, that are overrepresented in terms of violent crimes, right? What is that? Some people say. And then, given the fact that we are people in this chat that don't jump to conclusions, another airplane going by, we don't jump to conclusions. So let's look at some of the things that are out there, okay? Some of the things that were already said before was that it is true that if you have really poor and then really rich people in a place where there's a lot of young men and then you put them together in a box, crime is going to go up. In other words, the difference in economic status, okay, and the presence of young men, these things tend to happen in cities, right, will lead to crime. So one would say, the African American population tends to occupy the inner cities and urban areas a lot. So does this explain that? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't really explain it completely because there's still a overrepresentation. You all right? There's still an overrepresentation. Okay. The America factor that I mentioned before, which is, well, this is America. Why do it has a whole we could study it, especially in hindsight, and look and think about it, but let's not try to take out one piece and separate it. Let's just look at, oh, this is America. The this is America factor has been studied in the sense that people looked at Haitian immigrants, in other words, also black, in other words, also having a history of slavery, okay? But they came in and also poor, right? And the crime was not as much as the native black population. So, that kind of goes with the whole America uh, narrative. But notice we're calling it narratives because we don't know. These are just hypotheses. It's what you call hypotheses in a scientific frame. Hypothesis is just the beginning of things. Okay? Just because you look at data and then you have some kind of a story that fits the data, story wise, doesn't mean you have anything. Just a hypothesis. Okay? So we're like, the This is America hypothesis seems to make sense in that particular regard there. Okay? Is it also the case that perhaps the difference in rich versus poor is not as high in these immigrant populations as it may be in the Native American populations in these inner cities and such? You know, possibly another one, right? But here is the one that really gets people crazy. Do you know the one that gets people crazy? The one that'll get you banned from any, from most universities out there, the Charles Murray type speculations, is about innate biological predispositions. And the reason I'm bringing this up is to highlight thinking and truth. Hmm. Look at this guy. Look at Leroy. Look at Leroy. Leroy went there before we went there. Okay, he went straight there. Okay, so again, Leroy, great job in terms of asking, phrasing it in the question format, right? This is the format of creating, shall we say, logical propositions. You say, if A and B, then C, is it logically, could it be true? In other words, let me phrase Leroy's question this way. Could it be true that we emit, and by we means black people, hormones that increase our, shall we say, propensity to commit certain kinds of violent acts? Could it be true? Is a question that most people don't know how to ask. Because once you ask that question, what do they say, Leroy? What do they say, Dr. Thunder? And again, we're not going to change the fact that they say this. The majority of human population, we already know, cannot handle this kind of talk. It's not because this talk is very difficult. Uh, these these people can balance their checkbooks and do very complicated calculations. That's not this conversation is not very complicated. Okay, it's just that people have a difficulty overcoming certain narrative barriers and emotional barriers. That's the problem. It's not that we're doing complex calculus here. We barely did anything. Leroy just asked a question. What do people say when you ask that? They may say something such as, are you saying that there's some kind of a essentialism about race? Are you saying A, B, C, D? In other words, they immediately put you into a category, or shall we say a narrative. And all you did was make a logical proposition, which is if A and B, therefore C, question mark, is it possible? This is the beginnings of a question. You're not even at hypothesis land yet. You're just putting out logical propositions. But people cannot deal with that kind of thing. And we're going to explore, to close this conversation, the reason why I think, pardon me, another airplane, we're going to explore why, in an aggregate sense, it is justified for you to keep your mouth shut about certain questions like this. In other words, in this chat room, it is fine. But because of what we mentioned earlier about the mob mentality of the majority of the human population, you can't tell certain things to the majority of the human population because they will twist your words, they will take it and form something else because people just want to join a nice little group so they can fight another group. That's what people want to do. People actually don't want to sit there and think. They want to fight. People think, oh, human beings are really, rational creatures. Like, no, 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 no. People are just wanting to fight. That's what they want to do. They're looking for some excuse to fight. Oh, you wear blue? Ah, I'm going to kill you. Oh, you got a red mark on the left side of your head, right? Ah, I'm going to kill you. That's what people are looking for. They're looking for any excuse to do that. So let's ask some more of these questions that Leroy kind of put on the table. Could it be true that people of a common genetic stock, common primordial population, if you will, right? What people tend to call evolution and genetics, right? That to the degree to which, this is the A part, if A and B, then C. A part is, does biology affect your propensity to crime? On an individual level, we say yes. We know about psychopaths, sociopaths. We know about people with glandular problems in the brain or something like that. Hypothalamus damaged, something happened, they become way more aggressive. So, A, could A be true? Yes, we say A, yeah, we know about that data in A. And then B, what is B? Could particular populations, okay, that come out of similar primordial stock, shall we say, evolve together in a particular isolation, if you will, genetically. Could this affect these biological markers, which we say affect behavior? We say, yes, that is true. Then could C, which is the crime word, be affected? We say, yes. But the thing is, this is not saying that what we just said is true. We have not even begun to unearth how we can prove this. But the logical proposition is correct. It is plausible, in other words. Definitely possible, and even beyond possible, plausible. So could it be true? Yes. Could we ever know that it's true? Well, difficult, not because it is so difficult in terms of the actual science. It is difficult because you cannot necessarily ask those kinds of questions and get the kind, if you're doing that kind of research, I mean, the bell curve written by Charles Murray, I mean, this guy's still getting years and years after he wrote that book, he's still getting kicked out. What was the book about? Just looking at the differences in IQ in different populations and how that might result in, shall we say, differences in the economic outcomes, right? The Asians are smart. Is that such a crazy thing to say? So, the idea behind this whole stream is to be comfortable with not knowing is one of the wisest things that you can do, not just for your smartness, but for your actual health. What do you mean, my health? Well, if you are comfortable with not knowing, Terrence, atonement, I Bash, are you not gonna be more relaxed? Are you not gonna have less or lower blood pressure? Are you not gonna have less of a stress response if you're just comfortable, like, I openly ask questions. I'm comfortable not jumping to conclusions. I'm comfortable not mobbing up and getting enraged with my mob people against another mob and continuing and perpetuating the craziness that happens in the world. Is that not going to give you a more peaceful, happy, healthy life? Okay? This is not for the majority, but this is for those whom want to participate in a happier, healthier, and less knowing life. The more you are good with analysis, the more you realize that you don't know things and that jumping to knowledge is it's a great way of increasing your blood pressure, a great way of creating oppositions in the world. Because that group over there, they think they know something. This group over there, they think they know something. And then they're very convinced and they're going to exercise and agitate themselves into killing each other when in reality, neither of them knows anything. Right? So, crime, homicide increasing 30% between 2019 and 2020. The last highest increase year over year was between 1967 and 1968. So we have a new record. Overall, though, crime is low. Shout out to Steven Pinker. Okay? Crime has been decreasing. Violent crime has been decreasing worldwide. Wars and all those kinds of things. Deaths from diseases. The increase in the economic prospects of the third world is great. But we're talking about a particular spike here. And we're talking about the narratives that surround the spike. We're talking about the fact that it is quite impossible to know in real time which particular parameter affects it the most. But it is still important to be able to look at the parameters in terms of what's a plausible one and a less plausible parameter. Okay? So that you're not, at least so that you're not driven like sheep by the narratives in the media and by the politicians and so on and so forth, right? And also because these narratives and what we're allowed to say, the Overton window, if you will, affects political action, which has material effects on our lives. Okay? And then we used that and we talked about the different narratives and we went into the racial aspect, all the while to demonstrate uncertainty because the Socratic way of being, the way of always questioning things and understanding a way of consuming data is one of the biggest, it's a very simple thing, but it's one of the biggest simple differentiators that you can give yourself. In other words, the ability to analyze data, because it is not a question of complicated mathematics. It is a question of emotions. It's a question of emotions. It's a question of overcoming narratives in your head. It's a question of overcoming your need to run to your common group, whatever your status group is, whatever that identity group is, that need to run back there and cover yourselves with the knowledge that you guys claim to have about something that keeps you bonded against that other group which claims to have knowledge about something so that you guys can continue to agitate against each other is what's keeping you from smelling the roses. It's not that complicated, is it? Need I repeat it? That need, that urge to want to be certain, that urge to want to be going to go join some group whom has some knowledge that is opposed to another group whom claims to have the opposite knowledge so that you guys can work yourself up and be distracted from the roses is what keeps humanity where it's at. Notice I haven't said it's going to change. It's not going to change. However, as individuals, you can be aware of it and you can do something about it, at least in your individual life, as opposed to thinking that it's going to change in the group because It has never happened, and there's nothing that says it's going to happen. Our history says no, people are going to continue to be people. People are not going to change in this particular regard. But we can know and we can be loyal to big T truth. What is big T truth? Big T truth says it is plausible. It could be true that if A and B, then C, without saying that it is a certainty, without saying that we know for sure, but we can enunciate these truths, these logical proposition. A, shall we say, loyalty to logos. Loyalty to logos. Is that a good t-shirt one or no? I think last time we came up with an equation, which was that I forget what it was, but it was an equation. Meaning equals experience times consciousness. Yes. And that one was going to be a t-shirt. But loyalty to logos is what we mean here. Not loyalty to some kind of knowledge, but loyalty to logical propositions, possibilities, plausibilities, the shape of truth, and being able to enunciate it without being pulled all of a sudden into some kind of camp whereby everyone is going to sing some crazy song, worshiping some crazy idol of knowledge, false knowledge, against some other camp that's worshiping some other false knowledge idol, so that you guys can be distracted from really doing what it is you are here to do. What are you here to do? You're not going to know until you stop being distracted. You're not going to know until you can settle down and actually just be. Be comfortable with the uncertainty. Be comfortable with your knowledge that you're going to die. Be comfortable with the moment. Be comfortable with the existential angst of being alive, as opposed to trying to run into some little warm cocoon called the mob, where you guys can be clothed in your false certainties and kill each other. Peace.
In the den of iniquity, vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment, what a pity. Tomorrow never certain, what dwells behind the curtain, the face of evil lurking with that shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble, that either pop or topple, many will fall and stumble, let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso, cannons could reach the towers and the troops will storm the castle. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come get it. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come get it. With the rubble steady rising, and hearts are compromising. Convictions here are stifling, making evil appetizing. The fists are steady forming, and countenance is falling. Defenses are withdrawing, possibilities are falling. In these your circumstances, evil will make advances. Pick up your sword and lances, and be sure to take your stances. Victory is never promised, the battle is upon us. Gather the brave and honest, and the righteous in your corners.
Hey. All right. I think, okay, this was a track that I wrote, I think like 2000 and, probably 2002, 2003. Just a let me give you a verse. Nothing too crazy. Maybe I'll give you a couple of verses from different ones. I recall the days back when turf mapping, homie stay scrapping. You fight your crew to stay captain, move your roots and stay mashing. Actions judged by expedience, anarchy and disobedience. False mediums propagating false idioms, misunderstood for millenniums. Finally here to spread the cure. Pure, I'm healing them. But those days don't get it twisted. Yeah, I was there as a witness, and therefore I shall reset this back to the days when I wasn't on the guest list. Perfect this here and now, and for the more obstacles tearing down opponents, prepare to foul and get knocked out from the game. I'm clearing house. Bet y'all don't fear me now and never will. It's ever real, the raw deal. Fill you with fluorescent fluids until your pores spill. Overflow from the overdose. Older folks tried to tame me because I overspoke, overstepped my boundaries. You know, stuff like that. Stuff like that.